Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Cheeky Natives. It's your boy Little Khumalo, flying solo because Dr. Slay is taking some much needed time out because, being a slayer and a real life doctor takes some time. Today I have the ever gorgeous Sia Khumalo, and we'll be talking about his memoir, You Have to Be Gay to Know God, which was published this year.
Yes.
How are you, Sia?
I'm well, thanks, and how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. I've asked Sia to obviously give us a taste of what the memoir sounds like, so Sia will read a bit before we get into the conversation.
All right. We were waiters at a restaurant north of the Durban CBD. No customers had arrived because it was early in the shift. The takeaway order had come through over the mushroom-colored telephone at the end of the bar. When the meal's owner picked it up in person, nobody gave away that something had happened while we were wrapping it up. He was cheerfully wished a happy new year and sent off into the rainy night. The colleague had arrived late and inebriated, a dismissible offense, as I finished wiping chairs in the dining section. But he'd worked well drunk before. It's too late to call one of the others to fill in, the manager had signed wearily. I'll take this up with him after the shift. I must put an end to it. Seconds before, we'd been yakking in the kitchen. When I try to recall what we were joking about, my mind goes numb. I do know those jokes weren't malicious, they weren't about him, they weren't even gay-themed. Then wham! At knife point, I was reciting a creedal confession of his heterosexuality. Afterwards, the manager spoke with me as I swept some dust up onto the scoop. "We can report this to the police," he said. "We can have him sent home. Whatever you feel is necessary, it's your call." I thought of suggesting he tell the police captain who lunched at our restaurant about the incident. Beyond that, I didn't want to open it up to strangers. I could imagine my colleague out on bail, drunk and angry again. I could hear some disdainful police officer, dog will still say to him, "You idiot, when you threaten to stab a moth, you do them a favor bigger than offering them your cock to suck on. You give them something to run here and whine about. Don't threaten, just do. You pay the right money, case dockets get lost. But people you threaten, not so much." I couldn't tell which decision would be better. "I'm okay with whatever," I replied, feeling like a lost child who peed himself and didn't want strangers to know. He peered into my eyes. "Are you sure?" "Yeah," I lied, smiling light-heartedly, trying to pour the sweepings into the bin next to the bar. I think I even threw in a joke for effect. We needed some New Year's excitement around here. He left me to my work, and silently gestured to the bar lady to mix him a strong drink. "Everyone knows that you're just you," he added. "You have your sense of humor, but you never mean anything by it." That's it.
Okay, that is quite a powerful start to a book.
Yes.
Just like this incident,
Yes.
and it appears even from reading the book that it's an incident that has stayed with you.
It has.
But I guess before we go into, the meat of the book,
Right.
I wanted to ask, when I read the title, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a provocative title. And also the other thing that has happened is, while traveling to work, I've been reading your book and, the stares from people. So why the title?
Well, I'm trying to bring into public awareness something I've believed for some time. Religion, like most organized religion, has a picture of a God who is conditionally loving. As long as there are conditions to being accepted before God or to being accepted by God, somebody's making a profit out of that condition. So religion is booming business. It has been for thousands of years. Most people don't realize that there are economic implications of religion. As an aside, I write about religion, politics, and sex because what they have in common is they're about power. I call it the triquetra of power, the trinity of power. And power often takes on economic manifestations or financial manifestations. So when we understand that religion has a vested interest and a political interest in making people feel dirty about their sexuality, when we understand that when you look into the depth of religion at its truest form, there's a God of perfect love beneath it all. When you understand that you have to be yourself to be understood by God or to be known, to be accepted by God, then you can kind of start seeing through all of the economic or the political systems that leverage our feelings of inadequacy, our feelings of low self-worth. Just to quote somebody, Iman Rapeti also wrote a book. Mm-hmm. And one of the things she said in her book was that apartheid made the beautiful ugly. And that stuck with me because a lot of gay, lesbians, the LGBTIQ plus community, a lot of black people have an idea of what it means to be fully human that is outside of themselves. So it's, you either have to be white, or you have to be straight, or you have to be something other than you are. And the genius behind oppression is it tells you that the fullness of humanity is better represented some way. It's not what you already are. And as long as that message stays with us, we will always be a step removed from, call it God, call it your true self, call it liberation. You have to actually be yourself in your own skin to experience that freedom.
So, I mean, naturally, you say you write about sex, politics, and religion.
Yes.
And it's, you know, your book is laced with sex, politics, and religion.
Yes.
And I guess first I wanted to know why, you know, we always have conversations about people writing memoirs at like 60 or like 65, you know, because people have this perception that they've lived a full life.
Yes.
And that full life now means that they can impart wisdom, can tell a life story.
That's the theory.
And you aren't 50.
I hope not. Nothing wrong with me 50 years. I would have missed 20 years.
And so I wanted to know, like, at your tender age, in terms of, you know, the literary spaces or authority in memoirs, why did you decide to write this book in the way that you did, or this memoir at this age?
I always say I didn't jump, I was pushed. I wanted to write a very nice, very polite book for Christians to say to them, guys, this is how we have misinterpreted our scriptures. This is how we've misread, especially the New Testament, about human sexuality. And so it was going to focus on that. And when the commissioning editor found me, she found me through an article I'd written. I used to sign my article saying I'm working on a book. She says to me, let's talk about your book. And I told her about it. And they were like, well, do you want to focus as much or more on the backstory of how you arrived at your worldview? And I said, no. The reason I said no is that in Christianity, there's deep suspicion on the personal first-hand experience. It's you're supposed to put quote marks, the word of God, unquote, above your feelings, above your thoughts, above your experiences. Your pastor interprets it for you. You accept it as the truth or risk eternal damnation. That's just the way it is. So I was still conditioned like that as well. The irony is that the foundation of Christianity is mostly biographies. The Gospels are biographies. It's first-hand experience. It's just people telling what they experienced, what they saw, what they heard. That's really all that story is. So with much resistance, I'm shifted from the kind of book I was going to write, and then over time warmed to the idea of writing it the way they had advised me to. Very, very strange how that happened. I was reading Advocate Thuli Madonsela's, one of her reports. It was titled, was a state of capture, was it secure and comfort? I'm reading it and I realized, I caught myself skipping over all the parts that talk about which company acquired which company, all of these technical details. I realized I'm not interested in the technical details. I want to know who was in the room. I want to know who phoned whom. I want to know how many times that person was phoned. I wanted the juice. And when I realized that I wanted the juice, it hit me that readers would also want the juice, not the technical, structural theology. They would want the tears and the blood and the sweat. And so I that's how I warmed up to this way of writing it.
And I mean, I think one question that was at the back of my mind, and what staunch Christian would say, is like, who are you, Sia Khumalo? You know, are you a theologian? Why are you writing and telling Christians how to interpret the scripture when you aren't a theologian?
This is the strange thing about Christian theology. There are passages in the Bible that imply that each Christian is a fully fledged priest before God. So there's this idea of the universal priesthood of all believers. So every person in Christianity, in theory, has a direct connection with God, which is dangerous for hierarchy. Because if everybody has God on speed dial, then your whole system of mediators, gatekeepers, interpreters, it all collapses. Because then anybody, and this is what happened, for an example, in Pentecost, in the book of Acts, the people just started speaking in different tongues. It just happens that way. So that's how Christianity fundamentally is. And we are all, in theory, as I understand Christianity, no single Christian needs permission to start talking about what they, and this is a huge debate, because if you can say that about, say, Khumalo, you can say it about women as a group, as an entire group. Up front, you can say up front, Apostle Paul said, I do not permit a woman to speak. You can rip that one line out of its context and just forget the cultural background that he was speaking into. You can forget the cultural background whose risks he was trying to mitigate against, and you can silence a whole class of people, namely women. So it's a very dangerous thing that Christians try to do, which is spiritually police one another. And I've always thought of myself as that one Christian your pastor warned you about. Because I'm that one Christian your pastor warned you about, because I read, I think about what I believe, I shake it, I want to know what it's made of. I test it. No, I'm one of those people. I take things to laboratories, I pull them apart, I look at the components, I see if they fit together. Is there a better way that, is there a theory that explains this part of the Bible with more aplomb? That's what I do. I can't stop, I can't help it.
And so, I mean, a great part of the book is about that, right? It's about really understanding. I think of it as a chess game, more like a puzzle. You know, there's this huge picture at the end, but you need to go through the process in order to get to this huge picture.
I'm so glad somebody felt that it was that was the journey they were on when reading the book.
So for me, it felt like that. It felt like there were these little pieces that were coming together, you know, through the life story, right? Because, I mean, I felt this reading the book that this is how you came to where you are now.
Yes.
Like it was this puzzle. This sort of searching and searching and searching.
Correct.
So, I mean, there are many things that you speak about in the book, and I think it would be important to touch on a few of them.
Okay.
One is just, you know, I was really intrigued about your school days, and I want us to talk more about your school days. So, obviously, you joined a running team because you liked someone on the running team. Do you want to talk about just Sia in high school and how that experience was like?
I was the most awkward. I was that kid. Awkward, socially on the edges, weird. I was that kid. Terrible at sports. I was useless at all sports. And you know when other kids kind of are trying to pull you in towards the center, they're trying to make you part of the whole, but you're just such an odd shape. That's how it was for me. And most people, you hear a lot of stories of people are like, no, everybody was just a bully and all the kids were just mean. My experience was a bit different, and I think I do allude to it, where you get girls it was girls, you'd get boys, people who try to, make me one of them. And I was socially useless. I was. No, but part of the reason that's the case, I was born in Umlazi, which is a township south of Durban. I went to Ngophelelo Lower Primary School. I went to these schools in the middle of the township, and then one day my parents moved to another part of Umlazi, and they signed me up to a school that had, under apartheid days, been predominantly Indian schools. So now there's a culture shift. You're now a cultural amphibian, as I call them, and you're living in two worlds. You are not fully acclimatized to the one you were born in, so you're going to be a complete disaster in the one you're moving into. And then when it came to go to high school, there was another culture shift where it was what you call a Model C or a formerly all-white school, and I'm being exposed to genres of music I didn't know existed. I'm being exposed to ways of seeing the world I didn't know existed. So it just took me a very long time to acclimatize, to warm up, to thaw up to what I was immersed in, and which is difficult enough. But if you're doing that and you're coming to terms with your sexual orientation at the same time, then your experience of school can just be summarized in one word, and that's paralysis. That was really if I had to summarize my I knew I would need. I knew when I was a teenager, I was like, I'm going to need to be a teenager again someday, because I wasn't ready. But I think it's a lot of gay people who experience that, and then they come out later in life, and then they go through the hormonal teenage age phase where they sleep with everyone.
I mean, it's interesting you say that. There's a line you say in the beginning of the book where you were like, most people were living and dating.
Yes, they were.
I was watching TV. And I felt that was part of my life, right?
Yes.
Like I remember meeting someone a couple of years back, and they were like, you used to only sit in front of your grandmother's stoop and read. And I was like, yeah, because I was socially awkward, right?
Yeah.
And also I was different, and I knew I was different, but we lived in a society that didn't allow difference.
No, it didn't.
So you become a recluse.
Yes, you do.
And so when was if you remember, the first time you liked a boy?
Well, the first time the first fully fledged crush on a boy was when I was 12. And I do mention in the book, but the first dream was when I was 7.
Yeah.
So I had a dream about a boy. He was, and I think I do describe it. So I'm walking past his yard, because back in those days you could just walk through people's yards.
Exactly. I mean, I'm sure some parts of the country you can still do that.
Yes, I'm sure you can. And he was on his bicycle.
Yes.
I saw him, I walked past. Then I dreamt of exactly that same scene, but now it was in slow motion. And I realized that there was something happening at a hormonal, and just that, well, now I know it's hormonal, now I know it's sexual, now I know it's all of those things. But at the time, it felt like depths existed in me I had not known were there. They were suddenly being awakened. Like dimensions of my being I had not known were accessible or could have imagined existed were suddenly coming to life. And just it was seeing this boy and seeing his legs. So when I realized that I really have a thing for guys' legs. But the first fully fledged crush was when I was 12. And again, just this, when you look at a person and time slows down and you don't know what to do with yourself, and you're scared, people will know. People will take one look at your face and they will just know. And some do.
Yes, no, naturally.
No, some do.
I mean, you speak also a bit about the relationships with particularly your mom and your siblings, but also your relationship with your dad, right? And I want to know, like, there's a part in the book where you say something really interesting. You say, sometimes you don't even know is if you've come into yourself because of the acceptance of your mother.
All right.
And then, so I want to know the relationship that you have with your mother in comparison to the relationship that you had with your father, because you allude to a particular conversation that you have with your father.
Yes.
Where, he enters and,
Well, so the thing with my mother is she told me from very early in life that she loved me unconditionally. So concepts like unconditional love, God's boundless love, that was her language. So in spite of you as a child being disciplined for not doing what you're supposed to do, for doing something wrong, she will always tell you, in the background, this is all happening because you are loved. So when I told my mother, so the relationship has always been based on that. It doesn't mean it was perfect, and it doesn't mean we both went through it perfectly, but she has always been very clear that the foundation was this unwavering, unquestionable, unconditional love. With my dad, I think the foundation was the same, but I don't think he had quite he had quite realized that at an intellectual level, where I think he thought he was protecting me from the consequences of being different. So he would, throughout life, say, this is not what's expected of a man. And he would ask questions. And I do allude that to the book. He asks questions about, is there a woman? Is this happening? How will you cope with this situation if this is the kind of boy you are?
Is your manhood working?
He asked. But he asked. And what's happening now, and I think it happens as you grow older and you realize your time on earth is limited. You don't have time to mess around with people's expectations of who you're supposed to be. You can either embrace what's there, or you can live in self-imposed frustration about the difference between what is and what could be. You can live in perpetual frustration, and there's no reason to do that when you can enjoy things the way they are. And I can see my father easing into that very rapidly. I think for him, the biggest worry, the biggest concern was, would I be able to live a life? Would I be able to stand on my own 2 feet? And with that answer, to whatever extent I can assure him that yes, I can live my life on my own terms and defend it and whatnot, to that extent, I think he'll be quite happy for me. But it took him longer than it did with mom.
And I guess also it speaks about, the particularized manifestation of cultural patriarchy.
Correct.
Right? So there's a lot of, you have to further the
family
name,
line,
the family
name.
Yeah, you are the one who's holding the Khumalo name.
Yo, no pressure.
And I feel that's where, again, like his worries were, is like, because you're different,
yes.
Obviously in some reason we can't have children and we can't get married. People
yes.
just believe because you are in same-sex relations, you can't do these things. But,
You see, it's a scary conversation to have, because when you're gay and you say to your parents, I'm having a child, I mean, are you adopting the child? Are you having artificial insemination? Is that done in our culture? Do we have to talk to the elders about this? How do you explain to the uncles that, there's going to be a child, but you don't have to go out and negotiate lobola? You are not needed for this process. It doesn't. When somebody was expecting a song or a movie to go a certain way and they were completing the lyrics, but then it goes differently, and then your mind's like stuck. That's kind of the effect I think it would have on everyone.
Yeah, no, that's true.
And I had a friend who said to me when I started aggressively coming out, because there's coming out, there's like, you can ooze out of the closet, and then one day you burst out.
I mean, before we go that, I'm interested I had a previous conversation of a book, which I think the book that you've written and Donnell Elmore's book,
okay,
No Ashes in the Fire, which is also a memoir about coming of age and
right.
free in America, is a book that are in conversation with each other.
Okay, they need to read it.
And Donnell and I, in our conversation about his book, were speaking about the concept of like not understanding the act of inviting people into your life as coming out. So what are your thoughts about people coming out?
It's tricky because and I'm just going to complete the one tangent I was on about the friend who when I came out to her, she said, you can't come out to your dad because you'll give him a heart attack and then he'll die. So the idea there is you have to stay in the closet so that he can live outside of it.
This is true.
So that not just live outside of it, but so he can live with all that space.
Yeah.
You have to stay in the dark, in the closet,
in the little space.
Yeah. You have to be less so that everyone else can be, because your very existence kills. Your very existence threatens. It upsets. So the idea of coming out to you and me and people with a more liberal, I don't know, because liberal now has so much baggage.
Yeah.
So to people with a more liberal,
enlightened.
Yes, that has more baggage for me than most people. Because I'm in discussions with atheists. I call them the Enlightenment Brigade. Moving on swiftly. Sorry, listeners who are atheists. No offense. So people with a more liberal bent who realize that we are each responsible for our own emotions. So you're not responsible for what happens to you, but you are responsible for how you respond. You are responsible for the emotional space you choose to stay in. You can have a very high internal locus of control and all of those wonderful things. For those of us, there's nothing to come out from. Sometimes people have sex with people of the opposite sex. Sometimes they have sex with people of the same sex. Sometimes they have sex with both. So coming out in that world does not really mean anything.
Yeah.
But to the established, call it heteronormative nuclear family, 2.4 kids, 2 parents, to that world, which doesn't exist, by the way, because nobody has it that way. Nobody has it that way in the Bible. There isn't a single marriage like that in the Bible. And the one marriage that is like that, the wife seems to occupy a more prominent social position than the husband. So that fantasy doesn't exist. But to those people, there's something to come out from, which is very odd for me, because I look at those people and I think to myself, but you're all queer. and in denial. You might not be gay, but you're all queer and in denial, and now somebody has actually said what everybody was suppressing. So what we really do, it's just words. We just, one day you say, I'm gay, and suddenly you're different. No, I'm the same. I'm actually exactly like all of you. We're all queer is a more accurate, all humans are queer.
You know, I've had these discussions with many people,
Yes.
and you can obviously imagine
Right.
the outrage of, oh, don't force yourself upon us, you know, type of thing.
We are imposing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what is really interesting is Juno Muniz writes Cruising Utopia, and he speaks, the first line of the book is, he says, queerness is not yet here. And he speaks about like, you know, us moving towards queerness.
Yes.
And that's been a really interesting topic
Yes.
for me to, you know, internalize for myself.
Right.
Is that we're still existing in these spaces
Right.
where we aren't fully within ourselves, right?
Yes.
And therefore, queerness in its full manifestation is not yet here.
Yes, I was having a conversation with the director of Gala, Kevel, and I was saying, we might not be as in the corner as we used to be. So there was a time we were just our backs up against the wall as queer people. But now there's a little more breathing space. And one of the things I'm realizing is that the LGBTIQ plus, the black, the queer, all of those others, the other abled, all of them are actually a better representation of humanity than everything we have been programmed to think is. So we grew up on these Hollywood movies, and you see this idea again, be it the nuclear family or the guy who saves the day and gets the girl, whatever stories were painted in front of us, they're not real. None of those people exist. They are helped along by scripts and props and stunts persons. They don't exist. So it's something somebody made up, but we aspire to something that doesn't exist, and there's a lot of money tied into people's aspirations to be religiously pure. So this is back to the religion, politics, and sex. There's people aspire to be rich, and your pastor will tell you, if you're not rich, you need to give me 10% of your income so that God will make you rich. Which I'm like, God has a funny way of working. Why doesn't he just move the money around himself, since he's God? But we have these ideas painted in front of us, and when we remove those idols and we just look at ourselves, what's left is very queer, in quote marks. It's very other, it's native, it's black, it's indigenous, it's us. And before we run into inferiority complexes, the one thing our people got right as black people, they got us here.
Yeah, that's true. That is true.
All this time down history, we are here.
Still.
So they must have been doing something right all those millennia before colonization happened. They must have been.
And still, like, I mean, I remember reading Patrice Kankala's When the Call You Terrorist, and her first chapter is called Stardust, and she says, you know, our foremothers and forefathers willed us into existence.
Yes.
It is the only way that you're here. So it accords really strongly with what you're saying. It's like we can't be here without the willing into existence. Correct. Over and over again.
Yes.
I wanted to also talk about, you know, your time in the military, because, you know, obviously the military is like a boys' club. And I wanted to find out, like, you speak quite extensively about it, and obviously people who read the book will have a greater understanding of your time there. But just in brief, like how it was, and particularly your decision to leave, because that's what really intrigued me.
The strange thing with the military is how much I enjoyed it.
Is it because of the men?
Wow. It's because the environment is structured. So it's one of the, some people think, oh, military training must be so hard. No, it isn't. Don't get me wrong, it can be grueling. But you don't have to think about which insurance company you're gonna pick for your life cover or medical aid. You don't have to, there's so many things that are pre-decided for you. So if you're like me, I'm more likely to collapse from decision fatigue than I am from physical fatigue. So if you're like me, that's the best place you can be, and you can also immerse yourself into what you're doing, be it training or whatever it is, mind, body, soul. So it challenges your whole being. socially, you can get away with a lot more than people realize. So if you're gay in the military, and in my day, the policy was kind of like, don't ask, don't tell, everybody knows.
It's like an open secret.
It's an open secret, and if you have needs, let's call them that, there are people around who can help you fulfill them. My only problem, again, I was so socially awkward. It took me a while to realize it was right there in front of me.
It was here all along.
It was there all along. There are a few people I don't talk about in the book. Like there was this one sergeant. He took one look at me, and I think he knew. And I think it made him uncomfortable. Some people, I had a conversation with a journalist who said, from everything I described about the way he interacted with me, that this journalist says, no, that sergeant was attracted to you. But everybody was scared of that sergeant. He was a man's man, and he was brutal as a trainer, and he was, he was all of those things, and he kind of had low-key homophobia. But this is the beautiful thing about working for that part of government. Even if you're homophobic, you could not say it out loud. Because the motto was, we're all soldiers. Our gender is soldier. Our race is camouflage. And the constitution of the country is the constitution of the country. I was surprised at the extent to which the social dimension of it was, for the most part, followed. You could only get away with saying something slanderous or something derogatory. You had to be dog whistle about it. You could not say, you Murphy. You couldn't. Nobody did. You could say, you could be sarcastic, like, hey, sunshine.
Yes. Someone called you sunshine.
Everybody called everybody sunshine. Everybody was called sunshine. That was just the way it was. Everybody had a nickname.
And your decision to leave the military?
So, with an understanding that there was this dog whistle language all around me, I really understood that heteronormativity was the be-all, the end-all, and everything else. I understood that. And what I describe in the book is I somehow inadvertently got myself under the spotlight for something that displaced people who had ambitions. So there were people who had career ambitions, and I accidentally got in their way of those. Not only that, but I opened the door for other people from my intake to displace even more people. And one of the things I realized was, I have a secret, I'm gay, and it's going to be used against me. Sooner or later, with me being in the spotlight, and mom is sick back home, and there's been that issue, there are all these issues, but at the end of the day, there was just this secret. I realized the more enemies I was making as I saw it, as I perceived it, the more exposed I was. Exposed not in terms of my secrets being exposed, but just exposed in terms of I will not be able to form the kinds of networks that rely on, for an example, tribal allegiances. So if you're Zulu, you really have to make friends, or you really have to stick close to your Zulu buddies, and if you're Xhosa, you have to stick close to your Xhosa buddies. It was just a known thing. Though there was the network behind the networks, the decision makers behind the decision makers. It didn't matter so much how good you were on paper at something, which could be used against other people or could be used against you. What mattered was who you were to the people you were supposed to stay close with. And at some point, the fact that I was gay was going to be a hindrance. It was going to be a handicap.
I mean, also a large part of the book, which was really, really interesting for me, is that, 1994 came, we had elections. Everyone was like, yes, amazing.
We're free.
Okay. Constitution came along, we were like, yes, Constitution, yes.
96, yes.
And what I really, really enjoyed about your books here is because I feel like I'm in this class of let's call them critiquers of this beautiful constitutional document. Because a lot of people are against the fact that we can't critically engage with the text of the Constitution. Right?
All right.
And what I feel that your book really does well is that there are parts of the book where you really engage with what is actually equality for queer people, for black people in this country, for women in this country. And also the other thing that I'm really really interested in is your particular critique of patriarchy, because we read a lot of books about patriarchy and there is a certain monolithic way of critiquing patriarchy.
Yes.
And I think you do it differently.
All right.
Because I think what you are managing to do, at least how I'm reading your book, because someone may not get this, is you're critiquing how patriarchy is not only detrimental to women who it's meant to subjugate or other.
Yes.
So queer people, black women, any other non-binary people.
Yes.
But you're also critiquing how patriarchy is also harmful
Yes.
to men.
Correct.
So I wanted to know more your thoughts around, patriarchy
Okay.
and how we should go about, engaging topics around patriarchy.
Ooh, that's a tall order, the how-to part of it. But here's the framework as I see it. This is one of many possible frameworks. So nature is very efficient. Nature is not going to you're not going to have more than one part of your brain doing the same thing. It doesn't make sense. Just collapse the two functions into each other or something like it. That's the way a business works. You're not going to have two people doing exactly the same job if one person can do the job. And the reason I say that is the part of the brain that's responsible for racism is not different from the part that's responsible for homophobia. I'm not a doctor, but I'm prepared to bet a lot of money because in the seen experiential world, empirically, what we see is they work exactly the same way. Homophobia works the same way as racism works the same as misogyny. So how men end up being betrayed by patriarchy is it promises them position, power, privilege. It promises them this thing, but by feeding into it, they're feeding a system that will nail them at some point, some other way. The author of the book, How to Make Friends and Influence People, one of the things he says, a lot of us humans go around trying to sell things with a view towards what we can get out of it, but most people that we're selling to really just want to hear about what's in it for them. What is in it for me? So if we go to men and we say to them, end patriarchy because it's really harming the women in your lives, they'll be like, no, that's a problem, hey? Yeah, I can see how that would be a terrible, terrible thing. Then you tell them men are trash. And then
You mean you're swearing? That's basically swearing.
Now you swear. Now I'm not trash. And instead of owning the problem, instead of doing the work, they'll start defending, I'm not trash, I look after my wife, daughter, kids, etc., so I'm not the trashy one. So men are not going to, like, when you present a problem and you don't tell people what's in it for them, you're not really engaging them at their gut level of self-interest, because people are selfish. Can I swear on this podcast? People are selfish motherfuckers. But when you tell a man that, listen, the system that oppresses the woman, whether be it the woman in your direct line of influence or around you, when you allow it to go unchecked, do you know what's happening to you somewhere down the line? There's that one expression. At first they came for the socialists, and then they came for the socialists. I didn't say anything because I wasn't a socialist. So a lot of people are wired like that. It's happening to somebody else. What they don't realize is these machines, these systems run out of sacrificial lambs. So the one day it's going to be this one group of people, and then we'll get over that one group of people, or we'll run out of those people. It'll move on to the next. So because it's the same system, it needs sacrifices, because you're not fixing the fundamental issues of your society. You're not removing that mechanism, or you're not removing that systemic othering that keeps repeating itself, because it's always happening to somebody else. Sooner or later it gets to you. And that's the only time people will listen to you, is when you tell them, listen, it's not going to take a generation. This thing is not going to take decades after you retire. You will not have a retirement fund, because you've allowed this to happen to those groups of people. Therefore, at some point down the line, it's going to hit you economically or financially, which is why we talk about power, the triquetra of power. It's going to hit you structurally. It's going to hit you socially, where you will no longer be the apex predator at some point. And you don't even realize you are one now, but at some point you realize you will realize that you were part of the white men hegemony, and now at one point you didn't want to realize there was a hegemony, and then next thing you know, you are the other.
Yeah, patriarchy is a beast, but hashtag not all men.
There you see. When that's the first response, it means we're not listening.
And I think it also means we don't want to,
No.
Like you said something very powerful earlier. You spoke about the idea of why would you even want to give up this power, right?
No. Exactly.
So this is the whole point. It's like the people are holding on to power.
They are.
And again, I sometimes argue that it, although harmful in itself, particularly black masculinity, is a result of white hegemony, right? And racism and white supremacy. Because the boot has been on our backs,
Yes.
we have to put them on the necks of
That's
black
the only
women.
kind of. That's the only way of relating we know.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is sad.
It is.
I guess the one question that I also have is, what do you hope people get out of your book? Like when you were sitting down and writing it, there may have been an audience, but in particular, what is the outcome? Like, what do you hope people can get out of this book?
An alternative. So and one of the things you brought up just now is people ask themselves questions. One of the things we should be asking people, or people will are subconsciously asking themselves, is why would I want to let go of this power? So people are holding on to the only power they have, the only power they know, as little power as the structures of our society give them, especially with black men. So if you're a black man and you have a boss, or a white boss that you report to, there might be an extent to which you will pass some of that indignity down to those under your power. And one of the things I hope people see as they read this book is that there are other kinds of power that are not set over and against other people. You can have power with people. You can even exercise power under people. You never have to exercise power over them to survive. Because the moment you play into that system, which is, again, any kind of oppression, the moment you play into one of those types of oppressions, or the moment you get power from or through an oppression, you yourself have a target mark on your back. So there has to be another way of existing in the world in which you're not putting the target mark on somebody else, but then and by the same token, nobody else then has the right to put the target mark on you. You're less likely to have a target mark put on your own back. But it's not just about refraining from actively abusing others. It's also about stepping forward when others are being abused by others.
That's powerful.
Yes.
So I read your book, and you write really well. When I was reading your book, I caught a glimpse of like a Toni Morrison, because Toni Morrison does this beautiful thing with metaphors, like where you just get lost. And I felt like part of reading your book was like that, and it led me to the question of who are you reading? Like what are some of the books that have changed your life, or some of the writers who have changed your life?
That's an excellent question. I knew that this morning, like which writers have changed my life. But I'm going to give away a writing secret, in case anybody's interested. And I realized, I discovered this. I was reading, in high school you get given prescribed books for poetry. And then one day out of boredom, you go beyond the ones that you're supposed to study for your exams. And I think his name was Dr. William Carlos Williams. And he wrote a short little poem called the Note. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, which you were probably saving for breakfast. I'm sorry, they were cold, sweet, and absolutely delicious. So it's an apology note that now has been made into a poem. And all he did to turn it into a poem was he just took that note and he formatted it as a poem, and then boom, it's poetry. And when I Googled it, I discovered that there's a type of writing. It's called found writing, found poetry. It's very impressionistic, in that you write what something feels and looks like at first experience, at first glance. You don't overthink it. You just explain. You just describe as it is. And when I started looking through examples, and they'll bring up poems. They'll bring up. You also find it in art. One example of somebody who put nails on an iron, like a literal iron. Somebody puts nails. Then you ask yourself, will this thing still be usable? What has it become? When you start playing around, and we did the same thing. I was very briefly in graphic design. where you merge images. When you get good at that, you start seeing metaphors where most people don't. And that's where I learned how to do that. But now names are starting to come to mind as to who my inspiration is. There's a book on the other shelf in the room we're in by Sisonke Msimang.
Always Another Country.
Always Another Country. She writes beautifully.
Look, I recommend that book.
All
I'm
right.
like,
All right.
people, if you want to read poetic,
Yes.
lyrical writing,
She's
read Sisonke Msimang's book.
another head. And these are the people I approached for shouts. I knew Marianne Tham. I first knew her through a book titled I Have Life, the story of Alison Porter, which I read in, you're not gonna believe this, 1998, 99. I must have been 11 or 12. I don't know how any adult let me get my hands on that book, but I read it and it changed my life. It absolutely changed my life. And there've just been a handful of others. I recently finished Iman Rapeti's Becoming Iman, her autobiography. I want to write a review on it because I think it's awesome. Eusebius McKaiser, Bantu in My Bathroom. I think I mentioned how that changed my life in that my dad he became more open towards the idea of, okay, son, by reading Eusebius. So Eusebius has been a lifeline in that regard. I don't know who has my copy. Right, so that's... And another book I'm seeing that I'm thinking of, How to Find Your Moonshot by John Sene. First saw John speaking, I think it's the Yamaha Convention Center, I think that's what it's called. Mind-blowing. So a friend bought me a copy. I don't know where it is either, but I started reading it and I just, it breaks down. Everything he spoke about then gets broken down. And so that's my reading list all the way back to the New Testament.
All the way back to the New Testament.
Some theologians and pastors who will go unmentioned for now.
And interestingly, what is your favorite book in the New Testament?
I don't know. It's a juggle between Romans and Hebrews.
Ooh, that's interesting.
It's
somewhat Paul's.
Well, there's a dispute over whether Paul wrote Hebrews.
Yes.
It does, because it's not him.
It doesn't sound like him.
It doesn't sound like him. It's way too lyrical. He writes to argue. He fleshes out ideas. Whoever wrote Hebrews, I don't know what they were smoking. It is like in various times and in various places, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets, but in these last days, He has spoken to us through His Son. And then the Son it's like, these ideas are not being defended, they're just being laid out. But you can't contest them because they're so beautiful.
No, that's true. I actually really like John. You know, I felt like of the Gospels, you know, John captured me.
The epistles are scary, right?
No, naturally, you know. It's just like, I was actually talking about the epistles of Paul the other day, and like, you know, there's a scripture in Galatians 5:19 where he says, you know, what did it say? The results of your sinful nature are clearly evident.
The works of the flesh are clearly, yes.
Then I was like, you know what?
It's okay.
I'm going to close you again because I remember you dragging me a couple of years ago and I was like, I'm just taking a break from you.
This is why I said you got that far in Galatians, because I love you up until like halfway through Galatians 3. Then after that I'm like, it's okay. No, I can expand. I can write commentary on. I want to. That's my thing. I love writing Bible commentary, but the interpretations we've imposed on the text are still too much with us. If that makes,
I mean, what's also interesting, what you do in the book is, you know, which is something that I've also been doing, going back to the root, right?
Yes.
So going to the Greek and the Hebrew.
Yes.
In order for you to be like, actually, but this word actually means this, which means that.
Yes.
So maybe whoever was writing this needs to stop interpreting the Logos in the way that they want it to be interpreted.
Well, but human nature will always be slightly off with our interpretations. Now I kind of wondering, why John?
I don't know, like I think it's the account of So let's look at John 14 and John 15.
Ooh, John 14.
And where he speaks about his relationship with Jesus, and where, it's just the account. It's like it's different from Luke, it's different from Matthew, it's different from Mark.
It's very intimate.
Yeah. And John 15, when he speaks about the branch and the tree, it's just like, yes, John. And it somewhat feels like there's a more intimate relationship with Jesus.
I have a sermon in my head about this, but continue.
So for me, that's why I like John, and I feel like there was an authenticity and an honesty.
There was
in the way John wrote the accounts.
Yes. When I first read John, other than the feeling that there was something divinely inspired about the text I'm reading, I felt like I was reading a gay man.
That's interesting. I feel like that about Paul sometimes, but
Well, well, Paul is not a surprise. I mean, the biggest Pharisees are always the biggest. But with John, you're reading. I think the reason I'm saying it feels like you're reading a gay man. We're culturally conditioned, so we live in the 21st century where if a man deeply loves another man, he must be gay. Like that's just the label we slap on it. So I'm reading John. John had an unreserved love for Jesus. So, and his ability, his critiques on society, it's so penetrating, it's so refined, it's so subtle, and so multi-layered. And when I'm reading this, I'm thinking, you must have been gay. There was no way you could see through the systems in which people live with so much clarity unless you were like the most oppressed. And there was no way Jesus would have meant this much to you unless you were that oppressed.
That's quite deep. But again, like it's just, we could talk about John and the New Testament the whole day.
It's classic, yeah.
So at the Cheeky Natives, we are, myself and Alma are the land committee.
Yes.
So, people rate movies with like popcorns or stars.
Okay.
We don't do that. We collaborate and we confer with each other about when the land comes, these title deeds that we will give to people.
Yes.
So we give land for books and how we enjoyed them. So obviously you come from the KZN, and we know people who live in KZN always want to go back to KZN because it's much warmer that side in comparison to Joburg.
I don't know, hey?
So we want to give you the lush umhlanga, obviously.
Ooh, I'll take it.
So, because I think for me and for us at the Cheeky Natives, this book is really what I think is necessary in the current discourse.
Okay.
It's a necessary text to read in the current discourse.
Thank you.
So, again, Sia, thank you for coming on to the Cheeky Natives.
Thank you for
But more importantly, thank you for writing. Before we go, I have just, in your epilogue, you write something profound.
Yes.
You write, that this book began as a suicide note.
Yes.
And you end the epilogue by saying, as much as this book has saved you, the reader has also saved you, because you knew that there was going to be someone at the end of this reading.
Correct.
Right. So thank you. Thank you for the vulnerability in writing this particular story, and obviously for the provocative title. So everyone, we've just finished recording this episode at Bridge Books, which has copies and will have copies of Sia's book. So please come to Bridge Books and grab yourself copies. You can obviously get them at stores nationwide. Please do not DM the author and be like, hey, can you please send me a copy of your book, or like please send me a PDF. Like, don't do that. Please just like support Black people, buy their books. Thank you very much.